Yeah, we were clearing Hell's Highway, Highway 1 in
Oh my
Afghanistan.
gosh.
Yeah, it was Hell's Highway. It was in the southern province by Kalat, Afghanistan, where it's right by Pakistan. So February, March kicks off when it starts to warm up down there. They flood in from Pakistan, them being, the Taliban, and they hammered us for pretty much the entire summer.
So for 11 months, you're basically clearing the way in
Yeah.
these potential minefields. If you don't mind touching on like a little bit of that process, like what does that look like? What are you doing? What are you looking for? What type of equipment do you have?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, you can see it in the picture behind me for anybody looking on YouTube there. So that was part of our convoy. Usually our convoy had about 12 to 13 trucks, two wreckers. Almost every truck had a gun on it. I was a gunner. Actually, that rear truck that you see there in the picture, that was actually my truck there. So I was the gunner for our platoon sergeant. We had a medic in there, and then we had a Buffalo truck, which is the largest truck in the convoy, usually posted up somewhere in the middle. Had a huge rake on it, about the safest vehicle you could be in. And then we had these other ones called Huskies. They're basically meant to be blown up. They're the lead vehicle, and then when we go off route, the second Husky could come up and clear the off routes. They had different equipment on them that would allow them to either clear on a hard road or an off route, something like that. People hear demo and explosives, they think we did have EOD attached to us at all times, so they were like the next level of combat engineer. A lot of combat engineers are the guys that move up into EOD, which is something I was considering during my deployment as I got to know some of those guys. So we had a large convoy. We cleared, man, I could mess this number up, but it's over 180 IEDs in 11 months. And we were clearing Hell's Highway, Highway 1 in
Oh my
Afghanistan.
gosh.
Yeah, it was Hell's Highway. It was in the southern province by Kalat, Afghanistan, is where we were. It's right by Pakistan. So February, March kicks off when it starts to warm up down there. They flood in from Pakistan, them being, the Taliban, and they hammered us for pretty much the entire summer. And it was definitely intense. Still wouldn't trade that year for anything. But people think demoed explosives in the Army cleared in the Middle East. They think like Hurt Locker, right, is like the main one that comes to mind. It's not that exciting. The majority of those missions, I mean, we did, we took fire. We had a lot of crazy stories happen for sure. But, route clearance is what basically the counter ID route clearance. It's traveling. It's nothing more than traveling 3 to 5 miles an hour. And, we do have a lot of fancy equipment and tools, but there's nothing better than your eyes and being focused on the mission because, we were to the point where, we had about a 70-80 kilometer trek up to the SEALs base from our base. If there was a pile of rocks new, I mean, some of us could pick that out. And then
Wow.
and the training along the way helps that too, right? I mean, we trained at Fort Bliss over in Texas for a few months before we went over. And those instructors, man, I mean, some of their stuff was a little dated, but they did have good tips. I mean, they had good training material that helped us kind of spot different things, like stacks of rocks, something like that. Anything, in the dirt and sand, trails leading, because we had these things on our trucks called Dukes, right? And those basically are signal jammers. So, the old days in Iraq when, they're using garage door openers, cell phones, that kind of stuff to help detonate, these IEDs to either hurt civilians or soldiers. That stuff was not basically a non-factor as long as those Dukes were up and running. And we, anytime we dismounted, we had backpacks that did the same thing. There's still, when you're dismounted, there's still, pressure mines. I mean, there's 100 different IEDs out there, or maybe more, even mines and explosives that we had to train on. We basically were looking for, disturbance in the ground, the soil, the dirt, and they basically would have to run wire. They would have to run copper wire, sometimes for hundreds of yards. And
Wow.
yeah, and I mean, lucky for us, a lot of those guys were really lazy, and those are guys who, the low man on the totem pole, so to say, in the Taliban, or guys who unfortunately didn't have a choice, and it's the reality that, families are being held hostage or threatened if they didn't go and do this thing for the Taliban. If they ran out of guys in that area, that was their next resort, which, terrible for those people that had to go through that in that country, because there are good people, over in that country. But it was good for us because, that doesn't build a lot of loyalty in your ranks. So, if villages had any bad experiences with the Taliban, they were pretty quick to give them up because they knew we would go in and take care of them.
Does the only thing I've seen with like military and SEALs and stuff is like American Sniper. Have you ever watched that? And is that realistic?
Again, well, and most of that took place in Iraq. I did read the book. Actually, that book came out shortly before I bad memory, but I want to say that book came out shortly before I deployed. And I think we were in Texas when they did the big funeral convoy for Chris Kyle. And then the movie, I believe, came out after. One thing I distinctly remember from that movie is when you come back home and this is stuff, before Save a Warrior, I probably wouldn't be comfortable talking about on a podcast, but now it's like, I'm happy, if there's any veterans listening, hopefully, me being able to talk about it helps them or helps other people understand what veterans go through. But, I remember the scene where he was at the mechanic shop getting his car worked on. He was there for some reason and he just gets overwhelmed with all the sounds and noises, people talking to him. I remember that scene. And that scene kind of, especially at the time, because I was maybe not in as good a place as I am now. I remember that scene kind of overwhelming me just watching it. You know what I mean? And yeah, that was pretty insane. And that was very realistic, just like that overwhelming feeling that you get in social spaces and stuff like that. Because, I came back as a gunner, I'm responsible for everything, 5 yards out from our truck and on, as far as you can see, and to this day, 2013, it's been 12 years. Hypervigilance still very much a thing, man. Like it is hard to relax and not constantly be looking around a room and just focusing on what's in front of you, because once you do that and you're, other people's lives are on the line on you, focusing on everything, maybe someday it'll go away, but 12 years later, it's still very much a thing for me. So that scene in that movie specifically, Durbin, is something I related to a lot at the time. But yeah, I would say, in more and more of these veteran, these movies that are either based on a story of, one of the SEALs, I think they have a good hand in that, and that helps make them more realistic than just the straight up Hollywood action movies. Those definitely tend to be more realistic from what I've noticed.
That's nice to hear, because I was kind of wondering specifically what, and maybe you aren't comfortable sharing it, but what the hard to transition things are. And you touched on a few, like vigilance and noise and stuff like that. And I can only imagine.